February 19, 1945, 08:30 hours. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima swallowed men whole as they struggled up the beach. Landing craft disgorged waves of Marines into a landscape that seemed designed by nightmares. The sand was not really sand at all. It was volcanic ash, loose and treacherous, offering no purchase for boots or tracks or wheels. Men sank to their knees trying to run. Tanks threw their treads, simply attempting to climb the shallow beach gradient. Above them, Mount Suribachi loomed to the south, its slopes riddled with hidden gun positions that Japanese engineers had spent more than a year perfecting. The extinct volcano rose over 500 feet above the beaches, its observation posts commanding views of every approach. Machine gun fire raked the beaches from positions that seemed invisible. Artillery rounds walked across the ash in methodical patterns. Mortar shells fell with a frequency that suggested the entire island had been pre-registered for indirect fire. Every square foot of beach had been plotted, measured, and assigned to a specific weapon. The first wave suffered terribly. The second wave suffered worse. And beneath the ash, beneath the rock, beneath the seemingly lifeless terrain, over 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited in 11 miles of reinforced tunnels, connected to more than 1,500 underground rooms. Marines cleared a bunker with grenades and rifle fire, declared it secured, and moved forward. Hours later, Japanese soldiers emerged from the same position through connecting tunnels to attack them from behind. Positions taken at terrible cost were reoccupied overnight. The island itself seemed to be fighting back. And then, on the third day of battle, something new appeared on that ash-covered wasteland, something the Japanese had never seen before. Something that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of cave warfare across the Pacific. The Marines called them Zippos. The M4 Sherman flamethrower tank represented a desperate American answer to an impossible Japanese strategy. These 33-ton steel monsters looked almost identical to standard Shermans from a distance. This was intentional. A dummy gun tube made of half-inch face-hardened steel concealed the flame projector, preventing Japanese forces from identifying and prioritizing these high-value targets at range. Only when they got close enough to see the smaller nozzle protruding from that fake barrel could defenders recognize what was coming for them. The system that equipped these tanks was called the Seabee H-1, designed specifically for Pacific operations by Navy Seabees working alongside Army Chemical Warfare Service specialists. The Seabee H-1 carried approximately 290 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel in 3 tanks, 2 mounted in the hull and 1 in the turret. Compressed carbon dioxide at 300 pounds per square inch propelled this liquid fire through a nozzle that could reach targets at 400 feet. The turret could traverse 270 degrees, giving the weapon flexibility that earlier designs had lacked. A separate mainland system, the M42, used different specifications and higher pressures, reaching 360 to 390 pounds per square inch. That system offered variable nozzle sizes and different consumption rates. But for the Pacific Island hopping campaign, the Seabee-designed Seabee-H-1 proved more practical and reliable under tropical conditions. The improved Seabee-H-2 variant extended effective range to 150 yards, making it even more devastating against fortified positions. Either configuration unleashed liquid fire at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. The napalm adhered to surfaces and continued burning until the fuel was entirely consumed. Water could not extinguish it. Smothering it was nearly impossible. Once ignited, the substance burned with an intensity that defied conventional firefighting. Only 8 of these weapons landed at Iwo Jima on D-Day. 8 flame tanks for an island fortress defended by over 21,000 men in hundreds of pillboxes and more than 1,500 underground positions. It seemed like a pathetically small number, but within days, Marine commanders would declare that these 8 vehicles did more to break Japanese resistance than any other weapon on the island. The story of America's flamethrower tanks did not begin with military planners in Washington or engineers at established ordnance facilities. It began with desperate men in the field who needed something, anything, that could dig the enemy out of their fortified positions. The United States entered World War II with 0 mechanized flame-throwing capability. No doctrine existed, no equipment existed, no training existed. The concept emerged entirely from operational necessity. The early portable flamethrowers showed promise, but exposed their operators to terrible risk. A man carrying 70 pounds of fuel on his back made an obvious target. He had to approach within 30 yards of enemy positions to be effective. Japanese defenders quickly learned to identify and prioritize these slow-moving, heavily burdened soldiers. The solution seemed obvious: put the flamethrower on a tank. In late summer 1943, an officer of the 754th Tank Battalion stationed on New Caledonia conceived an audacious idea. What if they mounted a portable M1A1 flamethrower inside the bow machine gun position of an M3A1 Stuart light tank? The modification was crude. The execution was improvised. The result was revolutionary. The first combat test came on January 30, 1944, at Bougainville. Company A of the 754th Tank Battalion supported the 132nd Infantry Regiment in an assault on a bunker complex that American soldiers had nicknamed the Hornet's Nest. This position had resisted conventional attacks for days. Infantry assaults had been repulsed repeatedly. Artillery seemed unable to penetrate the concrete and earthen fortifications. The Japanese had constructed interlocking fields of fire that made direct approach suicidal. These improvised flame tanks changed everything. Working in coordination with infantry and conventional gun tanks, they helped destroy all 28 large bunkers in a single engagement. The flamethrowers were credited with eliminating 14 of those positions directly, while the remainder fell to combined tank and infantry action, supported by the chaos and smoke the flame weapons created. An estimated 200 to 260 Japanese defenders died in the assault, including approximately 120 to 180 killed inside the bunkers and another 80 or more cut down as they fled into the open. Staff Sergeant Jesse Drowley of Company B, 1st Battalion, 132nd Infantry Regiment, climbed atop one of the M3A1s under withering enemy fire to direct its gun onto a particularly stubborn position. He exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire while guiding the tank's weapons onto targets the crew could not see from inside. The enemy bunker had resisted everything thrown at it. Drowley's direction allowed the tank to place its fire precisely where it would do the most damage. For his actions that day, President Franklin Roosevelt would personally award him the Medal of Honor at the White House on September 6, 1944. But success revealed the weapon's critical limitations. Those jury-rigged systems carried only 10 gallons of fuel, enough for perhaps 20 seconds of flame. The ignition systems were unreliable and prone to failure at the worst possible moments. At Arawe, the flamethrower fuel sprayed without igniting, forcing the operator to throw a thermite grenade to light his own fuel manually. The fuel caught fire and completed the attack, but the incident highlighted the danger of unreliable ignition under combat conditions. Worst of all, the M3 Stuart's thin armor made it vulnerable to Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns. A weapon that required closing to within 50 yards of enemy positions needed far more protection than the Stuart could provide. The concept worked. The execution needed revolutionary improvement. Colonel George F. Unmacht of the Army Chemical Warfare Service took charge of systematic development at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, beginning in April 1944. Unmacht would later be inducted into the Chemical Corps Hall of Fame in 1995 for his contributions to flame warfare technology. His initial team, the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, possessed excellent theoretical knowledge but limited practical experience with tank modifications. The problem required a combination of chemical expertise, mechanical engineering, and combat awareness that no single organization possessed. The solution came from an unlikely source. 25 Seabees from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion joined the effort, bringing practical mechanical skills and an attitude of aggressive improvisation that would prove invaluable. These were men who had built docks and airstrips under fire. They understood how to make things work in impossible conditions. They had no patience for theoretical elegance that failed in practice. Men from the 5th Marine Tank Battalion contributed tactical knowledge and operational experience. They knew what crews needed in combat, where previous designs had failed, and what modifications would actually help rather than hinder. This combination of Army chemists, Navy construction workers, and Marine tankers would create one of the most devastating weapons of the Pacific War. The Seabees proved particularly transformative. They reviewed the Army's initial designs and immediately identified unnecessary complexity. The early prototypes had over 100 moving parts. The Seabees recommended reducing this to roughly half a dozen. Every additional component was a potential failure point. Every complex mechanism was something that could break under combat conditions. Simplicity became the guiding principle. A weapon that failed in combat was worse than no weapon at all. Two Seabees emerged as the primary designers. Machinists mate First Class A. Reich handled the mechanical components, applying his shipyard experience to the challenge of integrating fuel systems with tank hulls. He understood how to route plumbing through tight spaces, how to create seals that would hold under pressure and vibration, how to design components that mechanics could service in field conditions. Electricians mate Second Class Joseph Kissel designed the electrical systems, creating ignition mechanisms that would function reliably in combat conditions. His circuits had to work after the tank had been shaken by explosions, soaked by surf, and baked by tropical heat. Their collaboration married Seabee practicality with military requirements in ways that formal engineering processes rarely achieved. Working from sunrise to sundown in absolute secrecy, this composite unit produced 24 M3A1 Satan flame tanks for the upcoming Marianas campaign. The first prototype demonstrated its capabilities on April 15, 1944, before officers from all three services. The weapon performed flawlessly. Flame poured from the modified tank in a controlled stream that could be directed with surprising precision. Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith watched the demonstration and immediately requested 24 Satans for the invasion of Saipan. The Satan represented a massive leap forward from the Bougainville improvisations. It carried 170 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel, 17 times the capacity of those first crude attempts. Effective range reached 40 to 80 yards, depending on fuel mixture. The Canadian Ronson FUL Mark IV flamethrower replaced the 37mm main gun entirely. The Saipan landings on June 15, 1944, marked the Satan's combat debut. Marines encountered the same cave and bunker defenses they had faced throughout the Pacific, but now they had a tool specifically designed to defeat them. Flame tanks worked alongside infantry to reduce positions that had resisted conventional attack. The results were immediate and devastating. Japanese defenders, who had held their positions against artillery and direct tank fire, found themselves unable to resist flame. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical destruction. Word spread quickly among Marine units that flame tanks could break positions that nothing else could touch. In one documented incident, a single Satan engaged a cave complex containing approximately 200 Japanese troops. The flame tank poured napalm into the cave mouth in sustained bursts. Approximately 150 defenders died attempting to flee the flames. The remaining 50 surrendered, driven out by heat and smoke and the terror of what they had witnessed. This was unprecedented in the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers had shown time and again that they preferred death to surrender. Something about facing flame changed that calculus for at least some defenders. But Saipan also exposed new problems that only combat could reveal. The turret could only traverse 180 degrees, meaning the tank had to physically reposition to engage targets on its flanks or rear. The M3's armor remained dangerously thin, despite efforts to add supplemental protection. Japanese anti-tank guns punched through it at ranges that left no time for evasive action. Combat reports noted numerous shortcomings, even while acknowledging the devastating effectiveness of the weapon itself against fortifications. After the battle, commanders concluded that the Satan's limitations stemmed primarily from the M3 Stuart chassis rather than the flamethrower concept. The weapon worked. The platform did not provide adequate protection for crews who had to close within lethal range of enemy positions. This verdict drove the critical evolution from light tanks to Shermans. For Iwo Jima, Unmacht's team located 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks and developed the entirely new Seabee H1 flamethrower system. Reich and Kissel applied everything they had learned from the Satan program to create a weapon specifically optimized for the Sherman's larger hull and more powerful systems. The Sherman's thicker armor would allow crews to survive hits that would have destroyed a Stuart. Its more powerful engine could handle the additional weight of larger fuel tanks. Its wider tracks performed better on soft terrain like volcanic ash. Each installation required 150 pounds of welding rod, 1,100 electrical connections, 150 uniquely machined parts, and 1,200 man-hours of labor. The cost ran between $20,000 and $25,000 per tank. These were not mass production items. Each Zippo was essentially hand-built by specialists who understood both the engineering challenges and the tactical requirements. The process began with stripping the Sherman of its main gun and ammunition storage. Workers then installed the 3 fuel tanks, careful to position them for optimal weight distribution. The complex plumbing that connected tanks to nozzle required precise fitting to prevent leaks under pressure. Electrical systems had to be isolated from fuel lines to prevent any spark from reaching napalm vapors. The dummy gun tube was fabricated to exact specifications, complete with rifling grooves, visible from a distance to fool enemy observers. The craftsmanship showed in the reliability these weapons demonstrated under combat conditions. By war's end, Wehrmacht's flame tank group had produced 354 tanks across 11 different models. The flame tank received procurement priority equal to the B-29 bomber and the atomic bomb itself. This was not hyperbole or bureaucratic inflation. Official War Department policy placed flame tank production in the highest priority category, reflecting the conviction that these weapons would be indispensable for the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent more than a year transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress, unlike anything American forces had previously encountered. A cavalry officer who had served as military attaché in Washington and traveled extensively in the United States, Kuribayashi held no illusions about American industrial capacity. He understood that Japan could no longer win the Pacific War through offensive operations. The combined fleet had been shattered at Philippine Sea and later Gulf. Air power had been ground down through attrition. Industrial capacity lagged hopelessly behind American production. Japan was running out of oil, steel, and trained pilots. The only remaining strategy was to make American victory so costly that even winning would feel like losing. Kuribayashi rejected the traditional Japanese doctrine of beach defense and suicidal counterattacks. These tactics had failed repeatedly since Guadalcanal. Instead, he ordered his men to burrow into the volcanic rock, to create an underground fortress that surface bombardment simply could not reach. The volcanic terrain of Iwo Jima proved ideal for this strategy. The rock was soft enough to excavate easily, but hard enough to withstand explosive force. Japanese engineers carved out cave complexes with multiple entrances and exits. They connected these positions through tunnels that allowed defenders to relocate throughout the island without ever exposing themselves to American observation or fire. They installed ventilation systems to prevent suffocation. They stockpiled ammunition, food, and water for prolonged resistance. They created medical facilities underground. They established command posts that could survive anything the Americans could deliver from sea or air. Each position was designed to withstand direct hits from naval shells. Interconnected caves allowed defenders to shift forces without exposing themselves to American observation. The entire defensive network was built around the assumption that American forces would eventually land and that the battle would be decided underground. The statistics were staggering. 11 miles of completed tunnels out of a planned 17-mile network, over 1,500 underground rooms, hundreds of pillboxes and blockhouses above ground. Concrete walls ranging from 3 to 5 feet thick, with some critical positions reinforced to 10 feet, interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach. Pre-registered artillery and mortar concentrations that could be called down on any position within minutes. Every defensive feature was designed to extract maximum American casualties for every foot of island taken. American battleships pounded Iwo Jima for 72 days before the landings. This was not a brief preparatory bombardment but a sustained campaign, with B-24 bombers striking daily targets across the island. The preliminary bombardment was supposed to soften the defenses to the point where the assault would be manageable. Instead, when Marines hit the beach, they discovered that Japanese defensive capacity remained largely intact. The underground fortress had survived everything the Navy and Army Air Forces could deliver. During the first 2 days of battle, Marines discovered the horrifying truth about Iwo Jima's defenses. Positions cleared with grenades and rifle fire were reoccupied within hours by defenders who had simply withdrawn through tunnels, waited for the Americans to pass, and then returned. The loose volcanic ash immobilized wheeled vehicles entirely and threw tracks off tanks that tried to climb even moderate slopes. Portable flamethrower operators became priority targets for Japanese snipers. These men carried 70-pound weapons on their backs. They had to approach within 30 yards of enemy positions to be effective. They were visible, slow, and obvious. The portable flamethrower unit of 1 Marine Battalion suffered a 92% casualty rate during the battle. Almost no trained operators survived. Estimates suggested that the average battlefield life expectancy for a man carrying a flamethrower at Iwo Jima was roughly 4 to 5 minutes from the moment he began an approach on an enemy position. Some accounts cite slightly longer, but the difference was academic. Either figure represented a near certainty of death or serious injury. On D+2, February 21st, the 8 Zippos went into action for the first time. Divided among the 4th and 5th Marine Tank Battalions, 4 per battalion, they were pooled and dispatched from refueling points as needed across the battlefield. The demand quickly became insatiable. Every unit that saw a flame tank in action wanted one for their own assault. Every commander who learned of their effectiveness requested priority support. The documented actions paint a picture of systematic devastation. On March 1st, 2nd Lieutenant Leonard Blake's 3rd Platoon, Company C, 5th Tank Battalion, attacked a cave complex on Iwo's western coast during the assault on Hill 362A. Blake's platoon included gun tanks, Genie, Lucky, and Killer, with the flame tank Torch attached from company assets to provide fire support. Blake received the Silver Star for his actions that day, personally directing the assault and coordinating the combined arms attack that reduced the position. 19-year-old Corporal Leighton Wilhite, driver of Lucky, earned the Bronze Star with Combat Valor device for rescuing another tank crew under fire when their vehicle was disabled. On February 27th, Company C of the 3rd Tank Battalion worked a flame tank around to the reverse side of an enemy position and burned out a tunnel from which Japanese troops were emerging during the drive on Hill Peter. The surprise was total. Japanese soldiers attempting to reinforce a threatened position found themselves engulfed in flame from an unexpected direction. In early March, 3rd Marine Division tanks cleared an area designated Cushman's Pocket, a labyrinth of interconnected caves that required flamethrowers for each opening. The process was methodical and merciless. Identify a cave mouth. Approach under covering fire. Pour flame into the opening. Wait. Move to the next position. Repeat. Day after day, position after position, the Marines reduced the pocket systematically. On March 9th, 1,000 gallons of napalm and thousands of 75mm rounds were hurled against a single concrete communications blockhouse as the division reached the northeast beach. The position had resisted everything else. It did not resist flame. One Seabee electrician's mate, who operated a flame tank for 20 days, wrote from Iwo Jima with the clarity that only direct experience provides. One day we were assigned a pocket to burn out. We did in 6 hours, with 4 loads of fuel, what a tank battalion and 3 infantry companies had been trying to do for 5 days. The infantry would sooner see 1 flamethrower tank than a dozen with 75s. By battle's end, the 5th Marine tanks alone expended between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of napalm per day during the campaign's later stages. Over the 36-day campaign, approximately 360,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel were consumed on that 8-square-mile island. This figure includes both tank-mounted and portable flamethrower consumption, reflecting the scale of flame warfare required to reduce Kuribayashi's fortress. The after-action reports were unambiguous. The 4th Tank Battalion declared the flamethrower probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima. Captain Frank C. Caldwell of Company F, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, stated his conclusion in terms that required no qualification. In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. The weapon had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. The 713th Tank Battalion was the only all-flame armored battalion in the United States Army. 54 converted Shermans deployed to Okinawa under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas A. McCrary, a West Point graduate of the class of 1934. Unlike the 8 tanks at Iwo Jima, this represented a formation large enough to influence an entire campaign. Companies were attached to standard tank battalions, supporting each infantry division, with typically 2 to 3 flame tanks operating per standard tank platoon. Company B was frequently attached to the 1st Marine Division. Okinawa presented different challenges than Iwo Jima. The island was vastly larger, over 460 square miles compared to Iwo's 8. Terrain varied from flat agricultural land in the south to rugged hills and ridges in the center. The Japanese garrison numbered over 100,000, 5 times the strength of Iwo Jima's defenders. And General Mitsuru Ushijima had constructed defensive positions every bit as sophisticated as Kuribayashi's underground fortress. The 713th's first major action proved catastrophic. On April 19, 1945, at Kakazu Ridge, approximately 30 tanks, including 713th Flame, Shermans attacked in support of the 27th Infantry Division's 105th Infantry Regiment. Japanese forces executed a deliberate plan to separate armor from infantry. When infantry failed to keep pace with the advancing tanks, defenders allowed the vehicles to pass and then cut off their supporting foot soldiers. Anti-tank teams swarmed from hidden positions with satchel charges and lunge mines. The 47mm anti-tank guns that had been silent during the initial advance now opened fire from positions the tanks had already passed. The 193rd Tank Battalion lost 22 tanks in a single day, the greatest single battle loss of American tanks in the entire Pacific War. The 713th lost flame tanks in the debacle. Notably, the standard operating procedures of 24th Corps contained no section on employing main armament flamethrowers. The battalion had to write its own doctrine while fighting the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. The lessons were absorbed rapidly and paid for in blood. By May, the 713th was devastating Japanese positions systematically. The blowtorch and corkscrew tactic, coined by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., became the defining method of the campaign. Flame tanks provided the blowtorch. Demolition teams with satchel charges provided the corkscrew to seal caves permanently after flame had done its work. A typical assault sequence proceeded through 5 methodical steps. First, gun-armed Shermans suppressed positions with direct 75mm fire at ranges of several hundred yards, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. Second, flame tanks advanced under this covering fire to within 80 to 200 yards of their targets. Third, napalm was projected into cave mouths and bunker apertures in sustained bursts. Fourth, Japanese soldiers flushed into the open by heat and smoke and oxygen depletion were shot by supporting infantry positioned to cover exit points. Fifth, engineer teams sealed the positions with demolitions, preventing any possibility of reoccupation. On May 12th, flame tanks burned the town of Gaja methodically, structure by structure. One tank alone was credited with killing 75 to 100 enemy soldiers in a single engagement. On May 15th, a 713th platoon helped assault a particularly stubborn Japanese strongpoint. The attacking armor blasted away with 75mm guns and flamethrowers in coordination. 3 Japanese soldiers tried to reach the tanks with satchel charges, but were killed by supporting infantry before they could close the distance. The battalion developed innovative adaptations that no planning document had anticipated. A 400-foot hose extension connected a portable M2 flamethrower to the tank's fuel supply, allowing ground troops to carry flame to cliff-top positions that tanks could not reach. In one documented incident, Captain Tony Niemeyer of Company C, 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion, and a sergeant reached the top of an escarpment with this hose extension and eliminated several hundred Japanese soldiers who had believed their elevated position made them safe from flame attack. The campaign statistics for the 713th Tank Battalion are extraordinary by any measure. Over 85 days of combat from April 7th through June 30th, 1945, the battalion killed 4,788 Japanese soldiers. 49 surrendered. American losses were 8 killed or missing and 111 wounded, a ratio of approximately 40-1 when calculated against total American casualties. No comparable unit in the Pacific War achieved such disproportionate results. The battalion consumed 200,000 gallons of napalm during the Okinawa campaign. They lost 16 tanks to enemy action and 25 to operational causes, but mechanics kept the unit at over 70% operational strength throughout. Damaged tanks were recovered under fire, repaired in forward areas, and returned to combat within days. The battalion's maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep flame tanks operational. The 713th developed techniques that no training manual had anticipated. Tank commanders learned to fire in short bursts to conserve fuel for multiple targets. They discovered that approaching from unexpected angles increased effectiveness and reduced exposure to anti-tank fire. They coordinated with infantry to ensure that cave exits were covered before flame attacks began, preventing defenders from escaping to fight another day. Every lesson was written in blood and fire. Understanding why the Zippo proved so devastatingly effective requires understanding what flame does in enclosed spaces. The cruel paradox of Japan's defensive strategy was this. The cave and tunnel networks designed to survive naval bombardment and aerial bombing became lethal traps against flame weapons. The very features that protected defenders from conventional explosives made them death chambers when flame entered. Burning napalm reaches temperatures between 800 and 1200 degrees Celsius, far hotter than the interior of a conventional oven. The thickened fuel adheres to surfaces and flows like liquid into every recess, around corners, deep into tunnels. It cannot be extinguished with water. It cannot be smothered. It burns until consumed. In enclosed spaces, the burning fuel rapidly deoxygenates the atmosphere. A fire needs oxygen to burn. In a sealed or poorly ventilated space, that oxygen comes from the air the occupants need to breathe. Studies conducted during and after the war found that oxygen concentration in unventilated rooms dropped dramatically within minutes of a flame attack, falling below levels necessary to sustain consciousness. At reduced oxygen levels, mental confusion occurs rapidly. Loss of consciousness follows. Death by asphyxiation comes within minutes. Carbon monoxide reached lethal concentrations within 2 minutes of a flame attack in poorly ventilated structures. This colorless, odorless gas displaces oxygen in the bloodstream, causing death even when atmospheric oxygen remains theoretically sufficient. Carbon dioxide, denser than air, settled into low areas and accumulated at dangerous concentrations. Defenders who sought refuge in the lowest portions of cave systems, hoping to escape flames rolling along ceilings, instead found themselves in accumulating pools of lethal gas. Even occupants not directly in the flame's path suffered respiratory injuries that proved fatal hours or days later. At Saipan, Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade J. Saronde examined 4 civilian women found in caves with Japanese soldiers who had no external burns whatsoever, but died from respiratory failure caused by inhalation of irritant substances from flamethrower fuels. The fire did not need to touch them. Breathing the products of combustion was sufficient. The Japanese practice of connecting multiple bunkers via tunnels potentially spread fire and toxic gases through entire networks. A single flame attack on one cave entrance could kill defenders in connected positions hundreds of feet away. At Okinawa, approximately 23,764 Japanese dead were sealed in caves or otherwise buried by demolitions following flame attacks, representing nearly a quarter of the total garrison. At Iwo Jima, an estimated 3,000 Japanese remained in cave systems when the island was declared secure, either killed by flame attacks or sealed inside by demolition teams. Only 216 Japanese soldiers were captured as prisoners during the battle itself. Japanese accounts of facing flamethrower tanks are rare. Few who experienced flame attacks directly survived to describe them. Just 7,400 surrendered at Okinawa out of roughly 100,000 defenders. Most died in their positions. Captured documents from the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade on Okinawa showed the unit was particularly concerned about American flame-throwing tanks and yellow phosphorus incendiary shells. The 22nd Infantry Regiment emphasized careful selection of positions for close-quarter attacks on American tanks, with specific warnings about the danger of flame. The 1st Marine Division's own history recorded that the Zippo was the one weapon that caused the Japanese to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. Japanese countermeasures were desperate and often suicidal. The primary threat to flame tanks was the Type 99 magnetic mine, also called the turtle mine, designed to latch onto metallic hulls. Americans countered by bolting wooden planking to hull sides, sandwiching concrete between wood and armor, and spraying sand onto wet paint. These crude modifications provided enough protection to prevent magnetic attachment. The Shitotsubakurai lunge mine represented the ultimate expression of Japanese anti-tank desperation. a 1.5-meter wooden pole with a shaped charge capable of penetrating 150 millimeters of armor at 90 degrees. The overall weapon, including the minehead, measured approximately 2 meters. The soldier wielding this weapon was expected to die in the attack. There was no way to use a lunge mine and survive. The shaped charge detonated on contact. Japanese anti-tank squads, organized as formal suicide units, 100-man companies drawn from rear area troops, armed only with satchel charges and these suicidal pole weapons. American forces exploited the psychological dimension deliberately. On Okinawa, tank-mounted loudspeakers broadcast threats in Japanese before flame attacks. Attention, Japanese troops. I'm going to destroy all resistance in this valley. I have flamethrowers. These will be used on all dugouts and caves. The broadcasts continued with specific warnings about what would happen to those who resisted and assurances of safety for those who surrendered. 10th Army intelligence officers worked closely with Japanese language specialists to craft messages that would resonate with Japanese military culture. They studied prisoner responses and adjusted their approach based on what worked and what backfired. Intelligence analysis revealed a critical nuance that transformed psychological operations. Direct aggressive threats actually increased Japanese resistance. Messages using culturally appropriate language and military hierarchy produced significantly more surrenders. Phrasing that emphasized soldierly behavior and proper military conduct proved more effective than threats of destruction. During the first 70 days of battle, Japanese prisoner captures averaged fewer than 4 per day. After intensified psychological operations combining flamethrower demonstrations with refined messaging, captures jumped to over 50 per day by mid-June, culminating in 977 prisoners on a single afternoon on June 20th. This was unprecedented in the Pacific War and reflected the combined effect of physical destruction and psychological pressure. The Zippo concept survived well beyond 1945. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the Marine Corps assembled 9 Flame Sherman tanks from stocks at Camp Pendleton and Hawaii, forming the Flame Dragons platoon attached to Headquarters Company, 1st Tank Battalion, 1st Marine Division. The platoon consisted of veterans who had trained on these weapons during World War II alongside newer Marines, who had to learn the systems quickly. They landed in the second wave at Wolmido Island during the Battle of Incheon on September 15, 1950, and served throughout that conflict. The Korean terrain presented different challenges than the Pacific Islands. Winter temperatures dropped far below what these weapons had been designed for. Fuel viscosity changed in the cold. Ignition systems became less reliable. Napalm, that flowed freely in tropical heat, became sluggish and harder to project in Korean winters. Crews developed techniques to keep fuel tanks warm during operations. But the fundamental tactical situation remained similar. Enemy forces dug into hillsides and bunkers that conventional weapons could not easily reduce. Communist forces had constructed defensive positions across the Korean peninsula that echoed the Japanese fortifications of World War II. The flame tanks proved their worth again, reducing bunkers that had stopped infantry assaults and breaking defensive lines that seemed impenetrable. The next evolution came on the M48 Patton chassis. The M67 flamethrower tank, also nicknamed Zippo, entered production in 1955 with 109 units built. It first saw combat during Operation Starlight in August 1965 and served through the Vietnam War, including the Battle of Hue during the 1968 Tet Offensive. 2 M67s accompanied M48 gun tanks as part of the first armored force to enter that devastated city. Vietnam proved to be the final major deployment of dedicated flamethrower tanks. The jungle, terrain, and urban environments of that conflict suited the weapon's capabilities. Bunker complexes, fortified villages, and tunnel networks all fell to flame just as Japanese positions had 2 decades earlier. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had studied the Pacific War and constructed defensive positions modeled on Japanese tactics. The American response included weapons developed to defeat exactly those defenses. The M67 crews in Vietnam faced many of the same dangers their predecessors had faced. Enemy forces prioritized flame tanks for destruction, recognizing the threat they posed. Rocket-propelled grenades and recoilless rifles replaced the magnetic mines and lunge mines of World War II, but the fundamental tactical situation remained similar. The flame tank had to close with the enemy to be effective, and closing with the enemy meant exposure to anti-armor fire. The M67's retirement between 1972 and 1974 marked the beginning of the end for dedicated flame tanks. In 1978, the Department of Defense unilaterally stopped using flamethrowers, driven by shifting public opinion, evolving ethical standards, and the development of thermobaric alternatives that achieved similar effects through different mechanisms. Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, adopted in 1980, restricted incendiary weapon use near civilian populations. The United States deposited its ratification of Protocol 3 in January 2009, nearly 3 decades after the treaty was first opened for signature. Today, surviving flame Shermans can be found in museums across the country. The Fort Stewart Museum in Georgia preserves one. The Mahaffey Museum at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri displays another. The Museum of American Armor in Old Bethpage, New York, maintains one for public viewing. The tank, nicknamed Lucky from the 5th Tank Battalion, has its own remarkable story. Curator John Bernstein of the National Museum of the Marine Corps identified the tank in 2023 through distinctive weld scarring that matched wartime photographs. The unique pattern of repair welds on the hull, visible in period photographs, allowed Bernstein to confirm that this specific vehicle had served at Iwo Jima. The vehicle had been used for years on the Camp Lejeune ranges before being recovered and restored. Its survival was itself unlikely. Most wartime tanks were scrapped or worn out in training. Lucky endured. On August 15, 2025, the 80th anniversary of Japan's surrender, 100-year-old Leighton Wilhite reunited with Lucky at the museum's support facility in Dumfries, Virginia. He had received the Bronze Star with Valor device for rescuing another tank crew under fire on March 1, 1945. 80 years separated him from that 19-year-old driver, but the tank was the same one he had guided across Iwo Jima's volcanic ash. The reunion brought together a survivor and the machine that had carried him through one of history's most brutal island campaigns. Wilhite touched the hull of the tank he had once driven into combat, connecting across 8 decades with the young man he had been. The function flame tanks once served has been inherited by thermobaric weapons. Russia's TOS-1 multiple launch rocket system represents the modern descendant. These devices create massive overpressure waves and oxygen deprivation effects, similar to flamethrowers but delivered by rockets and missiles. The method changed. The underlying tactical requirement did not. Armies still need ways to neutralize fortified positions that conventional explosives cannot reach. Colonel Unmacht's observation from his 1948 article in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings retains its sting decades later. Ironically, it was considered perfectly proper to ruthlessly burn up the enemy, but absolutely inhumane to use gas. The comment reflected the moral contradictions that even contemporaries recognized in the weapons they employed. 354 flame tanks were produced by war's end. The 713th Tank Battalion achieved a 40-to-1 casualty ratio at Okinawa that has few parallels in modern warfare. The flame tank received procurement priority equal to the atomic bomb, reflecting the conviction that these weapons would be indispensable for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. That invasion never came. The atomic bombs ended the war before thousands of flame tanks could lead American soldiers onto the beaches of Kyushu. Eugene Sledge, the Marine infantryman whose memoir With the Old Breed remains the defining account of Pacific combat, wrote that the flamethrower operator's job was probably the least desirable of any open to a Marine infantryman. The men who volunteered for this assignment knew the odds. They did it anyway. The Zippo emerged from desperate creativity of men who refused to accept that certain problems had no solutions. It was refined through the combined expertise of Army chemists, Navy construction workers, and Marine tank crews. It was tested in battles whose names still echo with horror. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu. Fire has always occupied a special place in human fear, something primal that bypasses rational thought entirely. To see liquid flame pouring into your position, to know that no amount of concrete or earth can protect you, to feel the air itself becoming poison. Japanese soldiers who faced these weapons experienced something that transcended ordinary combat. 80 years later, the surviving vehicles sit in museums, their flame projectors cold, their fuel tanks empty. Visitors walk past them, perhaps noting the unusual barrel configuration, perhaps reading the placard that explains their purpose. Most move on quickly. These machines do not have the dramatic silhouettes of battleships or the sleek lines of fighter aircraft. They look like ordinary tanks with odd modifications, but these machines carried fire across the Pacific. They burned through fortresses that nothing else could reduce. They broke the back of a defensive strategy designed to make American victory so costly that even winning would feel like losing. At Iwo Jima, 8 flame tanks changed the course of a battle that might otherwise have consumed entire divisions. At Okinawa, 54 achieved casualty ratios unmatched in modern warfare. The Sherman Zippo proved that American ingenuity could solve problems that seemed impossible. The cost was terrible, the necessity was real, the effectiveness was undeniable. And the memory endures, preserved in museum displays and veteran testimonies, and the historical record of a war that demanded weapons capable of reaching into the earth itself to destroy fortresses that seemed impregnable. They were called Zippos because they brought fire where fire was needed, and they delivered it, one cave at a time, and one fortress at a time, one island at a time, until the Pacific War finally ended.